Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Weber Andreas and I am the chairman of the European Federalists in Styria, Austria, an association that has been working in Austria for the further development of the European idea since 1955. I'm very pleased to be here today for the opening of this online conference on the Schuman Declaration and the discussion about how to bring the European Union up to its challenges 70 years from this Schuman Declaration. The decision to call this conference was made in September 2019 as part of 6 grassroots events addressed to citizens from all social and economic backgrounds in European cities across the continent, especially also in Graz. Due to the coronavirus, it became clear to the local organization team in Styria that the initially planned physical meetings and discussions could not take place as planned in March 2020. And as we know today, cannot do so in the upcoming weeks and months either. For this reason, we are very happy to be able to hold the planned event together with our cooperation partners in a changed scope and in the course of this online discussion. As a short additional information, especially for our Austrian audience at this point, in Styria, Austria, we are opening with our online discussion today a week full of online events targeting the topic of Europe. The so-called Europe Week or Europe Week 2020, continuing from 4th to 9th of May, offers a bundle of digital and participatory measures, activities and workshops of different Styrian cultural institutions and organizations promoting the knowledge of Europe. We would be very happy to see and hear some of you again at those other upcoming online sessions. And we will put further information, links to our Facebook account as well as on our homepage. But please do not hesitate to contact us, the Federalists in Styria, directly in case of any further questions. In respect to the upcoming discussion, I may add a short thought of mine. Since the beginning of the European integration process, and as such the Schuman Plan could be seen, albeit on a very early stage, the European community has made, in my opinion, the mistake of favoring the economic sphere at the expense of the political dimension. It was believed that the political institutional unity would ultimately result from economic integration and its completion through the introduction of the common currency, the euro. In fact, a metropolitan area consisting of several nations only gains importance if it's not limited to being a large market, but takes on the features of a political organism. The European Union has not become such a political organism so far, and is therefore struggling with every new crisis from within or external. Therefore, it is time to take Schuman thoughts to a new level and adapt it to the needs of today. And this renewal always begins with good and widespread discussions like this one today. Finally, I would like to thank all the speakers at today's meeting for their contributions, their idealism, for the European project, as well as for all their efforts which have made this meeting possible. I'm confident that you will make a crucial contribution to the success of this online discussion, and I'm looking forward to an interesting, successful, lively debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andreas. I'm Paolo Vacca. I'm the Secretary General of the Union of European Federalists, UEF. UEF is the European platform of federalist organizations across Europe. And as many of you know, we are present in 24, 25 European countries. We are an old organization, so to say, because we were founded straight after the Second World War, and we have been, for this almost 7.5 decades, I think, at the forefront in calling for the United States of Europe, a federal Europe, however you wanna name it, in the various phases of the history of European integration. This meeting was supposed to be in Graz, as you have seen in the jingle that we projected at the beginning of the meeting. It was supposed to be in Graz at the end of March, exactly in the days when the Corona crisis started to hit Europe. And the idea of the meeting was to be a remembrance meeting, to be the occasion to remember the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration that falls on the 9th of May of this year, and on that occasion also foster a reflection on the future of Europe. But it was essentially an historical project and an educational project. And when we had to cancel the physical meeting, and we discussing internally with our friends in Graz, we said, hey, should we postpone it? Should we do it online? Isn't it an abstract discussion to have these days while Europe is in fact hit by other emergencies? And after a bit of reflection, we thought that we had to do it. We had to do it because, in fact, reflecting today on the future of Europe on the 70th anniversary of the Schuman Declaration is even more, is certainly less abstract than it was a couple of months ago. I think what is happening today, the way in which Europe is reacting to the Corona crisis, the way Europe is not reacting to the Corona crisis yet, and the way citizens are perceiving what's going on from the European level, will determine, the direction of Europe for a long period of time. And I think it may be, and it can go still either way. It may be that what we do in these weeks will convince citizens of the added value of the European Union and of what we can do together and the dangers of being divided. Or it may be that we are not up to the challenge as European Union, and that we crack under the weaknesses of the institutions, under the lack of resources, under the conflicting interests of member states. So I think what is happening in these days is really, really crucial. And so the reflection that we want to do today, thinking back to the days when radical decisions were taken outside the schemes of normal politics, and that marked then the history of Europe for very long, can be an inspiration to say the right things and do the right things as citizens, as civil society. Unfortunately, in these days, our means of influence are obviously limited, but with the means we have, at least online, we can have an interest, an influence on those who have the powers to act in these days. So welcome to this discussion, and I hand it over to Jacopo. Jacopo is working in the UEF office in Brussels as a project officer. He has been supporting the Schuman 2.0 project since the very beginning, and he will tell us a few words on the project so far.
Thank you for the introduction. I hope everybody hear me well. So I will share the screen now so everybody can join our presentation we have done on the Schuman project. So first of all, the Schuman project is a project we have begun from December 2019 with aims to contribute to citizens' understanding of the EU, its history, its diversity, and to raise awareness on remembrance, common history, and values. So, which are the main objectives of our project? First of all, empowering participants, create a stronger will to build a common future through the submission of participant own declaration. In fact, we are still running a contest named Schuman 2.0 contest, in which you can have the opportunity to write your own Schuman declaration to address the current challenges of Europe, also facing the Corona crisis. Then raising awareness of one of the founding moments of the European project, so the 9 of May 1950, and finally to forge a common view on the fundamental principle of the EU, and showing the participants of the Schuman Declaration 70 years after. We have planned a series of events, starting, as I said, from December. We have the Schuman 2.0 ambassador training, in which we train some young Europeans to understand the meaning of Schuman Declaration and to go around several events in Europe that we had in France, in Lille, on January, then in Italy, especially the city of Trieste, on February, then Tartu, we have a 2 days event on February as well. Bilbao, it was our last physical event in the Schuman 2.0 framework on the 6th March 2020. And then we had 3 different online events. So Hamburg was the first, we had through Zoom. Then we have this one, so Graz. And finally, next week on Europe's Day, we will have a webinar on Schuman. We will have a short video on the Schuman Declaration. It's from the historical archive of the European, the University Institute of the European Union in Florence. I'll show you. Just a minute.
When at long last the Second World War ended, the unification of Europe became a matter of survival. The young most of all, whose lives had been so scarred by the horrible experience of war, were growing impatient for action. But the states of Europe were more wary of each other than ever.
Depuis plus de 20 ans, le champion d'une Europe unie, la France a toujours eu pour objet essentiel de servir la paix. L'Europe n'a pas été faite, nous avons eu la guerre. L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup, mais dans une construction d'ensemble. Elle se fera par des réalisations concrètes, créant d'abord une solidarité de fait.
The man behind the new Europe was Robert Schuman, a Frenchman born within a stone's throw where the European Centre now stands on the outskirts of Luxembourg. Robert Schuman was from his youth a convinced European. It was as Minister for Foreign Affairs of the French Republic that he launched Europe on its way on the 9th of May 1950.
So this is a brief presentation of our Schuman 2.0 project, and I will leave the floor to Julius, who will be our moderator for this discussion. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Jacopo. Thank you very much, Paolo. And thank you, Andreas. Welcome, everybody, also from my side. I am Julius, and I'm one of those Schuman 2.0 ambassadors that Jacopo also mentioned, that were trained in order to facilitate the dialogue between citizens and the project. And now that you've learned so much about the project and all the background, I would like to get cracking. And I would like to introduce you, first of all, to the structure of the event, or the remainder of the event, and secondly, also the speakers. So today we have 3 speakers. We're going to have 3 presentations, which are going to be rather short, because the focus of the event should really be interaction and exchange and debate. So there will be plenty of time for questions. And in order to ensure that this is going to be very productive and very helpful to the learning of everybody, we're going to do it the following way. There's going to be a presentation, and after the presentation, there's going to be a small break of maybe just about a minute where you can reflect and think about what you just learned and think about questions. Then I would like to ask you to text those questions into the chat window. So I'm going to write a message into the chat. It's going to pop up on everyone's screen. I just wrote test, and I would like you to basically ask the question in keywords so that I know what the question is. And I would like to ask you to keep it brief and make it interesting for everybody, because I will then choose questions depending on how they fit in with the program. And I will then ask you to ask the question live. So we will take you and your video into the meeting, and you'll be able to speak live on the call to the participants of the panel and obviously the audience. And you will then receive an answer live. I'm just posting another message into the chat because I would like to ask you to adhere to a certain format. So I would like to ask you to write question to and then the person that you're addressing it to. If it's open, then you don't need to write to who you're going to address it, and then ask your question. And just to let you know, if you feel uncomfortable writing the answer in English, it's fine to write it in German as well, because as you might have figured by now, I'm Austrian as well, and I am happy to take your question in German and ask it in English to the members of the podium. Also, there is no obligation to ask the question live. It's also fine if you just text it into the chat. If you don't want to speak publicly, just put it in brackets that you don't want to mention it on the video, so that there is no pressure on anyone to appear on the video screen. So this is going to be the procedure, and I hope that this will ensure that everybody, or not everybody perhaps, but most people and as many as possible will get the chance to ask questions and to respond to each other as well, because it is about debate and not about a one-way discourse between experts and the audience. And that brings me to the experts that we have here today, and this is a very distinguished group of people. I'm going to start off with Aiste Mistsikonte. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. I hope this was sort of correct. I actually asked a Lithuanian friend to help me out. She's a law professor at the University of Graz, and also the managing editor of the Center for East European Law and Eurasian Studies at the University of Graz, and has previously obtained a law degree from the Mykolas Romeris University in Vilnius in Lithuania, and also studied European business law at the Lund University in Sweden. And her PhD was obtained at the University of Graz in 2017 with a thesis that I would just like to mention. It examined the interplay between European fundamental rights and the EU competition law, focusing on the presumption of innocence, which just might be interesting for anybody who is asking questions afterwards. Our second speaker today is not here yet, and the reason for that is that he's still busy. It's the president of our organization of the European level. It's the president of the Union of European Federalists, Sandro Gozzi. Sandro Gozzi has been the Secretary of State for European Affairs in Italy between 2014 and 2018 in both the Renzi and the Gentiloni government. Prior to that, he's already been a member of the Italian National Parliament, Camera dei Deputati, I hope that's again the right pronunciation, between 2006 and 2018. And prior to being a member of the National Parliament of Italy, he's been working for the European Commission for more than 10 years as official and then also as advisor to the European Commission President Barroso. And our third speaker today is Esther Nagy. Esther Nagy is the Secretary General of the Union of European Federalists, Hungary. So like there is an Austrian branch, there is also the Hungarian branch, and she's the Secretary General of that. Prior to that, she's been a public servant in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Hungary, and she's been working for the ministry between 1997 and 2009 in different roles. I can't name them all, in the Hungarian embassy in Ottawa in Canada, but also in the Embassy of Hungary in Tallinn in Estonia, and has also been working for the Common Foreign and Security Policy Department at the Hungarian Foreign Ministry. And also, notably, she's a graduate of the rather renowned Central European University in Budapest in the global economic relations program, which and the university might obviously be known to many following the current events in Hungary. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Aiste Miticonte for her contribution. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I hope that everybody can hear and see me well. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this. I'm sure what's going to be a very, very interesting discussion and a very interesting opportunity to discuss the legacy of Schuman Declaration. I'm also personally quite happy that we are discussing this today, because yesterday it was actually the 16th anniversary of Lithuania's membership in the European Union. So it's a nice day for me as well. So thank you also very much for a very kind introduction. What am I doing? So what am I going to talk about today? I will try to keep my presentation very short so that we have an opportunity for an ample discussion. First of all, I would say that it's highly symbolic that we are discussing the legacy of the Schuman Declaration at this particular moment during the Corona crisis in Europe, because, we couldn't really say that the situation in Europe now is identical or very similar to that was in Europe after the Second World War. Certainly not, but there are certain parallels that we could draw, in particular when I'm seeing that when I'm seeing the return of the dominant role of the state, how we see how the states are responding to the Corona crisis, and there's this rising criticism towards the supranational structures. So we will see now, and I will discuss this very briefly, how this parallels, at least in my view, to the time when Schuman was working on his declaration. Naturally, we all know, we know very well what the Schuman Declaration was about, but perhaps it will make sense to just reflect, to highlight some particular aspects that might be relevant for us today. So if I consider the historic background of Schuman himself, if we consider that he was born in 1883, he has lived, he experienced 2 world wars, right? So the first point to highlight when we discuss him and his legacy is perhaps that his own life was very much influenced by the notion of looking for a lasting peace in Europe as a statesman in France. Consider that immediately after the Second World War, the public opinion was in fact not at all ready for any kind of European integration. It was perhaps even hostile towards this idea. Consider it was all about repairing the ruins, the complete destruction in the countries that had suffered in the Second World War, and it was every country, right? So it was the absolute priority to take into account the national interests of each state. And very few governments would even mention the notion of European unity or some kind of unification. There was a certain apathy for unity, and also, of course, clear anti-German sentiments for very understandable reasons. After all, the horrors of war were very much still fresh in the memories of people. So the idea that Schuman actually promoted, the idea of the community of equals, what I find particularly important about it is that it was certainly very audacious. It was courageous in the sense that it was not something that has been tried before. Schuman realized very quickly that the many intergovernmental initiatives, which we used to have before as well, were actually not enough. They were insufficient a more bold, a more constructive act was necessary to actually bring a long-term peace. I even wrote down a very interesting quote by Schuman: "For peace to have a chance, there must first be a Europe." I found it very interesting how he put this emphasis on unification as a prerequisite. So in this context, I marked for myself several points specific to the Schuman Declaration that I think it might make sense to just highlight them again. So the very first thing that I think it's interesting to highlight, also in today's context where we're looking for certainty and clarity, well, actually he said, well, Europe will not be made united all at once or according to some single plan. Rather, it was all about laying down a bold vision. He even himself admitted it was a leap in the dark, into the darkness, considering that the plan was about readmitting Germany, of course, after total, what do you call, I forgot the English word, but in any case, after the Second World War, readmitting Germany as an equal partner was certainly a risky endeavor, an undertaking that was not necessarily likely to gather popular support in the European countries in Western Europe. So the first point is that it was not about laying down a very specific detailed plan, but about establishing a vision or a certain mission for the pro-European forces. And it's interesting that the foundation of this declaration of Schuman, or of this foundation for unified Europe, was a transnational or supranational equality, but also fraternity. Consider the declaration where it says that basically the first requirement is to end the enmity between France and Germany as the first major requirement for any unification of the European nations. So basically inviting Germany to cooperate, to integrate at eye level, right? It was certainly a very controversial thought, considering the German occupation in Belgium and the Netherlands, in France, of course. So this point was, of course, also very much supported by the United States, right? The third, I guess, point I'm talking about is that this unification of Germany and France, and then later other states, would be based on also a very controversial point, namely, of course, it was about pooling the war industries together, something that, of course, belongs to the national realm in the traditional sense, at least. So pooling the coal and steel industries of the enemies of yesterday, Germany and France, as the first step towards the European integration. So it was also something that has not been done before, another point for audaciousness of the plan of Schuman. However, at the same time, it is evident, at least implicitly, that Schuman already knew this is only the first step. Coal and steel will certainly be integrated, but he was, of course, reaching further and seeing it as the first stepping stone for further integration. I guess already in this declaration, we are seeing a certain aspiration towards this so-called spillover effect, where he says that, well, based on practical achievements in integrating economies, further solidarity will be created among the European states, meaning also in other areas of the economy, but also far beyond the economic integration. And of course, what's perhaps the most revolutionary compared to other international cooperation at the time, but also before and after that, was that these industries, these essential industries, would be placed under a very new type of authority, meaning, of course, the high authority, which was supposed to operate as a supranational rather than a traditional intergovernmental power. The high authority whose decisions, whose legal acts would be legally binding in all the member states. And of course, this would concern not only France and Germany, but also other member states who would be willing to join this community. Of course, the word union was not used at the time. So we see both a certain vision of, in terms of the content, but also in terms of the form, meaning that the content, the lasting peace, the economic integration will be achieved through supranational means, something that we, for example, didn't see in the Council of Europe either, although it was certainly a very important organization at the time and remains so now. But perhaps what I would definitely want to emphasize is that Schuman, but also his contemporaries, Monnet, Adenauer, they were not about economic integration for its own sake. It was, of course, seen only, or only is perhaps not the word, but it was seen as an instrument and not an end in itself. An instrument towards a European community that would be political, and even we could use the words spiritual, moral. There were certain foundations that we find in the Schuman Declaration that clearly highlight this aspiration that goes far beyond simply promoting economic integration among the states, but rather promoting a vision of a federal-like, but also spiritually close union among the European nations. And of course, we could say that precisely this vision, and Schuman being a true visionary of his time, way beyond others who were focused on intergovernmental cooperation only, this vision actually maintained the legitimacy, the credibility of the community, and then later the Union for 3 generations of Europeans. We could even say that this vision helped Europe during the times when perhaps the treaties did not offer answers to all problems, such as we all know, the European Union fundamental rights were established and developed much later, certainly not at the time of Schuman or the Rome treaties, but rather through the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. But nevertheless, certain shortcomings did not threaten the general idea and the processes of European integration, because there was a certain vision or mission uniting Europeans. And against this background, I was asking myself, as I was preparing for this presentation, what about today? When we speak about the Schuman Declaration 2.0, well, what would be the vision for the European Union today? Naturally, we could say what was true then remains true now. Peace, or the maintenance of peace, remains an endeavor that unites Europeans. That's clear. However, in the imaginations of most Europeans, the notion of war between the member states, we could probably argue that it has become unthinkable or even impossible, precisely what Schuman has actually attempted to achieve. So the question is whether alone the question of peace is sufficient to maintain this vision of common, of unified, united Europe. So I am thinking that also in this discussion, we will probably be raising a lot of questions in the midst of the rule of law crisis in Poland, in Hungary, in the midst of the tensions between the northern member states and the southern ones, between the newer eastern member states and the western European ones, in the midst of the corona crisis, where we see that even the member states among themselves are in a certain competition over resources. If we consider this context, it certainly makes sense to raise the question, well, if we were writing the Schuman Declaration today, what kind of a vision would be included into it? And as my final point, before I give the word to other speakers, is I believe that certainly a common market, a common economic integration and economic prosperity are not sufficient to keep the European identity strong and long-lasting, exactly as Schuman and Monnet have wished it to be. Definitely, if we want to maintain an ever closer union, an ever growing union, the questions we need to raise are, of course, what connects Europeans beyond the economy, beyond the free movement of goods, workers, capital, and services. So I will perhaps end my presentation precisely with these rather rhetoric questions, and I hope that we can discuss them together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a million, Mrs. Mitz-Konite. Yeah, a virtual round of applause. Obviously, this is not really possible here, but still, it is there. Yeah, for now, I'd like to turn towards the audience again. So you can now take maybe a minute, maybe 1.5 minutes to come up with questions and pop them into the chat window, as I explained before. Thanks a lot. We already see the first question coming in. So those that send the questions to me privately, I will pass them into the public chat just now. So that was one question, and then a second question as well. Yeah, we're going to give it another half minute so that everyone gets a chance to also to type the question, and then we'll get started.
Shall I begin, or should we wait for more questions?
I think there is one more coming from Miguel Alonso, and then after that one.
Okay.
Okay, so I think while we're waiting for Miguel Alonso to finish his question, Peter Rindler wants to ask a question live. So I would ask Jacopo to take in Peter Rindler into the video, if that's possible. so that we can all see him speak. Peter, could you try and speak?
Yes, is it working?
Yeah, that works. Perfect.
Okay, so my question would be the first one. Who do you think would be the institution to raise this question, to start a vision or formulate a vision about this Europe? Back then there were the states. Should this be the Commission, the national states? Should it be raised in the parliament? Where should this discussion take place?
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your very interesting question. And as I already saw it written, I started thinking about it. And probably your question is the most challenging one of all, right? What I think is that, in fact, the Schuman vision was not even a state vision. It was actually an individual. We could say that what's unique about this revolutionary vision that actually led to European integration was that, in fact, it was born in the mind of a person and not in the mind of the French government, for instance. In fact, from what I've read, the French government did not even know about his attempt to write such a declaration until the very last days or even hours when it was presented to the government. So I wonder, I do not think, to be honest, that an institution alone could present a new vision. What an institution such as the European Commission, perhaps, or the European Parliament are able to do is perhaps help or facilitate the discussion, which would give the voice to the European citizens rather, because I'm wondering about the issue of course, a certain credibility of the European institutions. As we know, they are not necessarily so well known at national level. Some of them may not even enjoy a lot of popularity, like the European Commission, oftentimes for the wrong reasons, but that doesn't change that. So I do think that this vision cannot just be manufactured, I guess. It is a very long process that will probably depend on certain personalities, because Schuman was a certain vision that came to him without, well, he was of course in contact with other great Europeans, like I forgot the name of the Italian Prime Minister now, yeah, and also speaking to Adenauer and speaking to Monet, of course. But it was not really an institutional vision. It was a vision of a person who had lived wars and thus wanted peace. So I wonder if it's an open question, actually. And if I could perhaps add to this answer, the answer to the second question I received about the climate change being the new connection. It's also a very interesting point, because perhaps the more pressing the problem, the more likely it is, I suppose, to have this capacity to unite Europeans. And the bigger it is, the clearer it becomes, of course, that it's impossible to solve it at national level. Just like the major issues in Europe after the Second World War, the states actually saw that their economies, their relations are so interconnected with one another that closing up and remaining within this nation-state vision was actually not really sufficient. Just the same applies to the climate change debate, right? That the states are actually seeing that it's fully impossible to solve this at a nation-state level. So perhaps it will, especially since the new generation is, of course, so climate conscious, right? So I think that in the next years, it will definitely be one of the cornerstones of the new European the major questions of Europe, so to speak, that can connect the European nations. And perhaps, is it okay if I continue with the Corona question?
Yes, maybe just briefly. We will have more space for questions at the end of the event, but maybe if you can briefly have a take on this as well.
Very briefly, without taking too much time. Well, I think it's difficult to say at this point still, because as we know, this crisis came extremely unexpectedly, and we will probably be able to evaluate its impact perhaps not today and not next month, but perhaps next year or the year after. But I could definitely say that we are seeing the increased role of the nation state. I don't know about the populist ideas, which are very much alive still, right? But what we are definitely seeing as a tendency is that the state is taking over. But here we have to, of course, emphasize, I do not think that it shows or it points towards some kind of my last two sentences, to some kind of weaknesses of the EU. But as I was preparing for such a question, for instance, I was thinking we may not forget that the European Union has very limited competences in governing questions of health, protection of health of citizens in the member states. So while we definitely are seeing this tendency of, well, is the European Union on the background and the states are suddenly the active ones, we have to, before we criticize this role of the EU, we may not forget that it is not always capable of taking over, because it may not have the competences for that either, because that's how the states wanted it.
Great. Thanks a lot. On this note, as I said, we're going to have more time for questions towards the end, but I'd like to turn towards the next speaker, Sandro Gozzi. Welcome, and thanks for joining us in the middle of a probably very busy schedule. I already introduced you at length beforehand, so everyone knows who you are, and you can get started immediately.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity, first of all, and thank you very much to seize the opportunity which is given by this tragic period of the coronavirus to give even more importance to what the Schuman Declaration still means to us 70 years after. That declaration, which wanted to get concrete achievement, because only with concrete achievement we could create a de facto solidarity. That was the core of the message of Robert Schuman. And I would like to start from this, because it is exactly this teaching that we have to follow now in this crisis without any precedent, a crisis which doesn't have any health precedent for our generations. I mean, last time something similar happened was in 1919 with the Spanish flu. So something completely new, without precedent in economic terms, because what we are going to lose is something that never happened since the Second World War, but also something which it doesn't have any precedent also in political terms. And we have to organize our response to the crisis, managing the urgency and thinking the recovery, addressing the urgent needs of our citizens, and laying down the basis for a European recovery. And this means concrete achievement, talking about Schuman immediately. That means the concrete answer that we have to give to our citizens. And on this, Europe has already done things which were unthinkable a few months ago. But that means also to prepare the European recovery, thinking the unthinkable as well. And let me dwell on this. First, I would like to remind what Europe has done so far, because it is very necessary to understand what Europe still has to do and how and why. I mean, this time, the European response has been there. I mean, we have suspended the Stability and Growth Pact. We have suspended the rule on state aid because we had to give to the European government the margin for maneuvering to answer to the crisis. The European Central Bank has launched a program which is very strong, a real umbrella against the speculative attacks against our economies and our finances, beyond 750 billion euro. We have given an additional instrument to answer to unemployment crisis with the SURE mechanism. We have put at the disposal of our regions with less bureaucracy, with less binding modalities, 37 billion euro. We have provided the possibility, given the possibility with the European mechanism, stability mechanism, to cover the health cost of our member state. All in all, what is our answer? All in all is an answer of 4,000 billion euro. And this is very important because it makes a difference with the way European Union has answered to the crisis of the past. This time, it hasn't been too little too late, as it was for the Greek crisis, which could have been avoided very easily if we had intervened at the very beginning with concrete answer. This time, it hasn't been like during the migratory crisis, where the European Union wasn't there when the Italians or the Greeks needed the European Union to manage the political refugees and migratory crisis. This time there has been a concrete answer, but this is about the urgency. It is clear that we have to think about our recovery. And to think about our recovery means, first of all, not only to use better the Europe which exists, but to create the tools, the policies, and the political dimension of Europe which still not exist. Because after all, the Europe which has provided answer is the Europe which exists, the community Europe, the Europe of the Commission, the Europe of the European Parliament, the Europe of the European Central Bank. What is the Euro which have failed so far, which has been blocked? It is the Euro group. It is the Europe when you have to decide by unanimity. It is the Europe where only one government can, with a veto, with a national veto, block the European action. And this is why we have to think the recovery, first of all, knowing that we have to really boost the economic and social European recovery. Because if we fail this, we will lose the trust of our citizens. So it is essential to launch this recovery fund, to launch this recovery bond, because they must provide us with additional resources, new resources, fresh money. We have also to get out of the debate of yesterday world. I mean, I want to tell you, as we are talking mainly to Austrian friends, we must think that we are entering a new world. We must wear the glasses to better read the new world. Even if about this history of the recovery bond, nobody is asking to the Austrian taxpayer or to the Dutch taxpayer to pay for French or the Italian debt. It is absolutely not this the point. The point is how we can better use the European budget to use it a guarantee, issue new bonds, which do not put together the national debt, existing debt, but allows us to go on the market and to get fresh money and to get liquidity in order really to finance a new European recovery plan. So it has nothing to see with the debate that we have seen in Austria, in the Netherlands, Germany, because that was yesterday's debate. That was the debate that we had 10 years ago around the Greek crisis. And we must bring Europe, bring the European public opinion to a new approach. And this is exactly, this idea of recovery fund, recovery bond is exactly the new approach. Why it is important? Because we must show that we really believe that we have a common future. We must show that we really believe that a European social and economic plan of recovery, it is essential. Because the national plans are not enough. Because we must preserve our internal market. We must preserve our Eurozone. We must avoid that there are too strong divergences in getting out of the crisis. And because we have a common interest around this, and we trust each other so much, then we are ready to issue common bond at European level to finance that plan. You understand that this is not only a very good financial solution, it's not only a very good economic solution, it is a step into another idea of Europe, the idea of Schuman. It is a step which can allow us to move, to take a step forward, going from a useful association of state to a solidarity community between peoples. It is this, around this idea of the recovery fund. And this is why it is very timely to talk about Schuman Declaration, talking about the recovery fund, because it is really behind thinking the unthinkable. And we are living extraordinary times, and we have to think the unthinkable. And why we need to foster our mutual things, why we need to start to trust each other again, why we need new solidarity instrument and policies between peoples, and not only useful cooperation between states. Because we must regain control at European level on transnational issues, which are totally under control if you limit your approach to, with national policies. I mean, we have to fight against climate change. We have to prepare our ecological transition. We have to rule for the goods and for the many, the big digital multinational firms. We must find a new instrument to ensure our human security, our stability. We must take a much more prominent role on the international scene, because this new world after the crisis cannot be delegated only to the Chinese or to the Americans. We have to establish a new relation between Europe and Africa. These are all transnational issues. And are all transnational issues. On top of this, we have to ensure the need for a new health policy at European level to strengthen what we do at national level. For all this, we need to focus on a new idea of solidarity among us. And this is the basis. And this is why this passage is so important. And it can be the basis to launch a new phase of deep European reform. We can, this time, on the basis of the crisis, on the basis of a good solution we are negotiating, but they must be good. And this is why we as federalists, we must keep pressure to ensure that the outcome of the negotiation on the budget, on the recovery fund, are up to the challenge, are at the right level, because on this we can build up that a deep European reform that it is absolutely necessary, and it is even more necessary today to prepare the recovery, which must be also democratic recovery. And this is why we cannot tolerate as federalists that the state of health urgency is used to violate rule of law, fundamental rights. I'm very concerned about what is happening in Hungary. I'm very concerned about what is happening in Poland. I'm very concerned with the fact that we must ensure at European level that the national government cannot use the excuse of the health urgency to reduce the right of the national parliament, the rise of the fundamental freedoms of all our citizens. This is something that must be at the core of our response, at the center also of our recovery. And this is with the last point, this is also true for the digital tools that we are going to use to get out of the crisis. I mean, the app that we all will use to manage the phasing out from the confinement, to trying to progressively come back to free movement of people, to a more normal life, even if it will take time. They must respond to some fundamental European principle. They must be voluntary. They must protect our personal data. They cannot violate our privacy. They must be interoperable. They must talk each other. The app that you develop in Austria must allow you to circulate also in Italy or in France. And so we have to ensure that these different national solutions are compatible with each other. And this is also part of the democratic response, of the democratic recovery. And this is something on which we must and we can and must build a new federalist action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Once again, virtual applause to you from everywhere. yeah, from all across Austria and also Europe, because we did circulate the invitation also to the Schuman 2.0 ambassadors and many other people. So indeed, this is a very international event. As before, I explained this to the participants already. We're now going to have a 1-minute break where people can think about questions. You're free to take a sip of water if you like or something. And there's already a first question coming in from Andreas, and there will be more coming very soon. So we'll just have a moment for everybody to type. Oops, now I'm unmuted. We see a few questions came in already. First of all, I would like to turn to Johannes Steinbach, who posted a very long question, and I would like him to expand on this a bit and to ask his question live. So Johannes, if you can unmute your microphone.
Hello, I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm from Styria. I was involved in the preparation of the meeting in March. And now I see a lot of friends of mine here on the monitor. I was working as a journalist, and in 1985, that's 35 years ago, I first met the European Federalists. There I heard ideas which I found really great. Ideas from creating a common currency, like it was called euro, or I heard the telling about they already made in the mid-60s demonstrations to open the border controls. So free traveling all over Europe was one of the ideas. And another idea was to make elections for a common European Parliament. That sounded for me 10 years before Austria had the accession to European Union. It sounded like utopia, that I thought it will never happen. But now it's common, and we all know that. So my questions are, one, what do you think about United States of Europe, a system where much more competencies are on the Union, on the United Nations, and much less for the national states? And the other question is, I miss some countries which are on the map or on the globe in Eastern Europe, and European Union has the strategy not to talk about accession of, for example, Ukraine, Moldavia, or other states, or Caucasus states, and even Russia. They keep it in distance. So my questions are United States of Europe, and a Europe of the map of Europe, and not of the European Union member states. What do you think?
And especially, Sandro, since you are a European parliamentarian for France, maybe you can also respond to this question from the French perspective, indeed.
Okay, do you want to take other questions, or I start to answer to this?
Maybe this one is enough for one. Or
Okay.
I mean, we can take it. We can take a second one. Maybe we can take another one from Andreas Weber, which is if you see any indications for, or if you see any signs of overcoming this difficult situation related to national vetoes that you mentioned. So if there is anything ongoing in the Commission or in another institution where there is fundamental reform on the horizon. And if the current crisis could be a catalyst for that process, because obviously we've been talking about that very often. So what is currently happening, if you like? Maybe that's the second question I'd like to take in.
Okay, thank you, Julius, very much. Yes, dear Johannes, my answer is yes, absolutely. The United States of Europe will happen. My problem is when. And my answer is as soon as possible. But I am totally convinced that as it was totally unthinkable, I mean, go back. Let's go back even further back to compare to your example. The idea of European integration, the idea of federal Europe, was developed in a manifesto written by certain Altiero Spinelli when Europe was dominated by the Nazi fascist forces. And Spinelli was in a sort of prison, confined in an island in the Mediterranean called Ventotene. And there, at that time, Spinelli wrote things that in part, partially, have already happened, but that looked totally out of, out of possibility at the time. Think when Mussolini and Hitler seemed to win the war, he was writing about the United States of Europe. When Schuman made the declaration, it was 5 years after the end of the most bloody war that mankind has ever known, which was the Second World War. It was 5 years after the discovery of the Auschwitz concentration camp. 5 years after another bloody war over the Rhine between France and Germany. And him with other people like Alcide de Gasperi, which, by the way, he was first elected in the Austrian parliament. I don't know if you know, Alcide de Gasperi was elected, and there is still his seat in the Austrian parliament. And then he was elected in Italy, and he became prime minister in Italy. And people like de Gasperi, Schuman, Adenauer, talking among them in German, by the way, because they all spoke, they were all three, they were very fluent in German. At the time, thought the unthinkable, to put together steel and coal. I mean, to put together the economy, a market between people and countries which were at war only 5 years before, 5 years earlier. And many things have happened. So I think that today we have still to think the unthinkable, and to think the unthinkable, and which is feasible. The unthinkable, which is feasible and necessary today, is to make concrete the idea of European sovereignty. Today, we have a debate around sovereignty. We have nationalists, extremists, neo-fascists, extremists on the left, on the right, which want to destroy the European Union, which was to empty from inside the European Union, which are against the multilateral cooperation, because they think, they say, they claim that national sovereignty is the answer. And the fact that we don't have national sovereignty anymore is the main cause of our problems with migration, with terrorism, with unemployment, and so on and so forth. Well, the analysis can be even partially right. It is true that national politics and national sovereignty have lost control on transnational issues. The answer of the nationalists is totally wrong. The answer today, which is more and more necessary, and which must be at the core of our approach when we talk about the European recovery strategy out of the crisis, the core is we need today to build up a European sovereignty, because we need a new strategic industry policy at European level to be competitive on the global scale, on the global scene, because we need to strengthen, to implement a Green New Deal at European level to fight against climate change, because we need to develop a new agenda for human security, which means social security, which means economic security, which means physical security. And it is a common good that we can ensure only if we act also at European level, also if at European level we give us the tool, the policies, the capabilities to intervene and to play our role on the global scene. This is the European sovereignty, because we need a big research project to develop at European level, because we have to prepare our future together in terms of technology, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of digital challenges. This is the European sovereignty. This is urgent. This is not something very far in the past. This is something that we have to do now. And if we insist on this, if we win the battle of idea around European sovereignty, we must say, of course, this means that we want a European power. But for us, the European power must be a European democratic power. Therefore, we have to eliminate the most undemocratic tool that exists in the European Union, national veto. National veto denies the existence of Europe. National veto is the opposite of the democratic activity, because democracy requires a majority and a minority, and require safeguard for the right of the minority, but the possibility for the majority to discuss, to take a decision, to implement it. National veto is the denial of democracy and the denial of Europe, because it prevents Europe from acting. So our idea of European sovereignty and power is democratic. The representative of the state decide by majority in the council, the representative of the people decide together in the other chamber of our federal construction, which is the European Parliament. This is something that it is absolutely feasible. It's something that is there, something that on which we have to push now. And this brings me also to the idea of national veto. What is the Commission doing? It's very shy. We think that already, we as a UEF, we think that already today, we have to exploit all the possibility offered by the treaties to move ahead with a group of willing countries. We don't want to exclude anybody. The door is open for each government, each state, each people that want to join on new projects. But if there is a dynamic group of peoples and states that want to deepen their integration, want to build up a sovereign Europe, want to regain a real sovereignty, for example, on digital issues or on defense issues, on security issues, they must allow to go ahead. And we have enhanced cooperation. We had different clauses in the treaty that we could exploit already today, but it is clear that we must also put the issue of majority decision in the next European reform. And on issues like taxation, on issues like the multi-financial budget, multi-annual budget, we must decide by majority, and we must decide with the role of the European Parliament. This is something that is absolutely necessary, is something that is urgent, is something that, after all, is much more thinkable than the unthinkable that Schuman or Spinelli had the courage to think 70 years ago. So I think that for us, it is a much easy road, and we must run it very fast along this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just to ask, as far as I understand, you need to leave very soon. Is that true?
Yeah, if you have another question, I can take it, but then I have to leave you. I don't know, how much time do you still need?
That was the question, basically. So if there was any last minute question from the audience.
If there is another question, I will be happy to answer, and then I leave you.
And for the moment, I don't see any, but I'm gonna wait for another few seconds if there is any question. You're welcome to speak up in the microphone as well. This is your last chance. Otherwise, I think that you answered everything.
I would like to ask in the microphone to Sandro. Do you think that will take us next 35 years or next 70 years until we reach this target?
I would like to be able to present to the European voters on 2024 already some very concrete, unthinkable answer that we have managed to think and implement during this legislature.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sandra. I hope you understand that answered the question. We will move on to our next speaker, and would like to thank you once again for
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And yeah, our last and final speaker will be Esther Notch, as I mentioned previously. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Esther, who's joining us from Budapest, as we can see with her nice background. Welcome.
Thank you, Julius. And I'm actually very happy that I can be here. And it's thanks to the coronavirus crisis, because otherwise it would have been a personal meeting. And this way that it's an online meeting, I can be present. So I'm very happy of this opportunity. And actually, this Schuman Declaration, I wanted to put a little bit also in a historical context, because you might also know that the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy happened 100 years ago, exactly this year. Okay, it was about June, because that was the Trianon Treaty, so the closing treaty of the First World War that made a dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, which was actually an integration. It was kind of an integration when Austria and Hungary belonged together in one country. And actually, it's a Hungarian tragedy also that happened at this time 100 years ago. And I think that the Schuman Declaration, in a way, and European integration is providing an answer to this problem or to this tragedy. So it's the European integration, as it is today, is kind of healing the wounds of the closing peace treaties of the First World War, actually. And there is another historical context, that it was exactly this day 30 years ago that the first Hungarian parliament after the socialist era was seated, so exactly on the 2nd of May. But unfortunately, today the Hungarian parliament couldn't make a joint meeting. So the ruling party privatized this event, so they didn't include the other political parties, which is also a very telling signal of the state of democracy in Hungary. That you might know also a lot other details, but yeah, that's just for today's celebration. And thanks for ISTA. Also, Hungary is also since 16 years already a member of the European Union. And that was a big hope, a big dream come true for us, actually. When I worked in the foreign ministry, there was actually a national consensus on the Euro-Atlantic integration process. Everybody wanted to modernize, everybody wanted to access the EU, the NATO, and it was really a big enthusiastic period for us. So I was really happy to be able to be that I was Hungarian diplomat in this period, because it was a very positive process for us. And unfortunately, what we took a little bit for granted, that once we are a member of the European Union, then it's going to be a done deal. Everything is going to be fine and smooth, and we don't have to worry about our fate anymore in this sense. And unfortunately, life proves differently, because since 2010, we experienced a very, very fast and hard backsliding in democracy in Hungary due to the Orban regime, which is declared to be an illiberal regime, which is for me still kind of puzzling how this whole thing could happen inside the European Union. But it has happened, and there are some clear proofs. For example, from 2018, the Sargentini report that was accepted by a two-thirds majority in the European Parliament. So this report also approves and admits that there are serious breaches of democratic rights and rule of law in Hungary. And the sad thing is that Hungary is still an EU member state, and of course that's not a sad thing. Sorry, not that's the sad thing, but the very sad thing that is it's still somehow on the level of declaration and on the level of knowledge. Everybody knows that, but there is no real measures taken, or that we don't really see at the moment how to make it better or how to change it. And of course, everybody says, and we also know that Hungarians elect the Hungarian leaders because it's the national elections, and it's absolutely true. But for Hungary, it's also a fact that since especially 2010, the EU funds have contributed very much and very in big amounts compared to the to the size of the economy to the government strengthening its power position. And I think that if we talk about the original idea of Schuman and the original European idea, that was not in the picture that the EU would help a kind of an authoritarian style regime to remain in power, to stay in power. And actually, that would be one thing for me, which is very important, that the basic democratic rights and the rule of law, which the EU is very much funded on, should be respected and should be enforced, I think, at any price throughout the EU. And I think that this is actually a European problem. It's not only a Hungarian problem, because we see also that once this thing is popping up, then there are other followers within the European Union. And actually, as a result, now being in Hungary and talking with you, you are in Austria, and now I feel that somehow a virtual Iron Curtain is up again, because we have very different life in Hungary and very different system in Hungary, like in Austria. And for me, it's very hard to imagine that the European Union as a union and an integration of values and common like the idea of common peace and integration and development is going to be such divergent processes within the European Union. And I fully agree with Sandro as far as the unanimity rule is concerned, because I think that this intergovernmental nature of the EU is actually stopping the EU to take efficient measures in order to ensure the basic values, the democratic values and the rule of law, and also the transparency in the spending of the EU funds. I think that it should be absolutely the biggest interest of all EU countries to have more transparency throughout the European Union, and to be able to ensure the transparency and also the spending of the funds. And this would be also the best interest of the Hungarian citizens. And as far as the divergence is concerned, we know that in social matters, in many things, there are big differences within the European Union. And I think also this coronavirus crisis really highlighted the fact that not only the health services, but social networks are very different throughout the European Union. And if we have like a new health policy on the EU level, that would absolutely benefit all the citizens throughout the European Union. And for example, just to mention one fact, that in Hungary we have unemployment scheme for 3 months. So if you get unemployed, you get money from the state for 3 months only. And everybody knows that it's quite impossible to find work after 3 months. And I think that a joint social Europe would really benefit Hungarian citizens, and that would also encourage the trust in the EU, that it's not only our government who does whatever he wants with us, but there is also some kind of a European network or European standard in this matter. And that's also about the sovereignty debate. We see that our government, the Hungarian government, is really doing many times accusing Brussels and doing this anti-EU rhetoric, billboard campaigns, and blaming the EU for things, or for example, there is no talk about EU help in case of the COVID crisis. On the other hand, they mention China and Russia and other countries that they send some help, which is actually much smaller than the help what they got from the EU. But also this help, we don't know where it goes, because it's the Hungarian government who is responsible for distributing it, and we don't see any transparency in that. So that's another factor, that the Hungarian citizens in general have a lot of uncertainty about the EU or what the EU help, or they don't know about it, and they have a lot of uncertainty in general in terms of how they will be able to recover after the corona crisis. To reach out to European citizens, I think more directly would be a very nice idea and a very efficient tool to make Europe more attractive all throughout the EU, I think. And especially what I feel is that even after 16 years of the big accession of the 10 Eastern former socialist countries, we still have a big difference between this bloc, I wouldn't call it a bloc, but this group of countries, and the more developed countries. And there was this question about whether the European Union could be enlarged to the whole Europe as a geographical category. And I think that any further integration or any further development of the EU is depending on how successful the convergence can be ensured with the existing members. And I'm not only talking about East and West, but also North and South. So what we see is that there are real problems with the convergence. And also, I know says that there is this there are several open cooperations, like the Eurozone, like Schengen, like we have all different integrations inside the European Union. But for example, Hungary is outside of the Eurozone, and even though the Hungarian people would very much support to become, to introduce the euro, the government doesn't want to do that. So Hungary would fall out from anything what the European Central Bank would do for crisis management. So this gap between us and the Eurozone, for example, is going to be even larger. So that would be also a good thing if Hungary would be kept accountable for joining the Eurozone, because that's what we promised when we joined the euro, when we joined the EU 16 years ago. So we should not be able to sabotage this. And I think that it would be also in the best interest of the Hungarian people, as we also could see that the Hungarian forint really went down very much during the crisis. So we are very vulnerable as a result that we still have our national currency, which is of course a clear proof that on the national level, it's much more difficult to resist such a crisis, such an unexpected and unknown crisis like the coronavirus crisis. I think that would be all for me for the moment. So there would be some more room for discussion, and I'm open to answer any questions if there are from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Once again, virtual applause to Budapest. And yeah, once again, we're going to have a quick break for everyone to think about questions. So the first question has come in. It's from Peter Rindler. If you want, you can ask the question live, Peter. If I don't hear you, I will just read it out. I think I'll read it out in this case. So how can countries like Hungary and Poland, I need to read it first, I'm sorry.
I can also read it if you want. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. If you can ask it yourself.
We were speaking about this majority vote to have this, not have one single country blocking all measures. And at the moment, there is often Hungary blocking measures against Poland, Poland blocking measures against Hungary. And how realistic is it even that those countries at the moment would even accept something like a majority vote, would not block it? Because in fact, all states have to agree to not decide with this old veto system anymore. Is it realistic?
That's great. Thank you for explaining that, Peter. And I would like to add another question to this, if I may, quickly before you respond, Esther. And that is how to bridge the gap between states that are so unwilling to integrate further with our European Federalist vision. And if this doesn't really tear us apart, that we want to go so far into the Federation and other countries want to remain so much for themselves. So how do we bridge this gap, and how do we prevent the Union from falling apart?
Okay.
Yeah.
No, thank you for the questions. Actually, you must have heard of the latest the Authorization Act, and I think Sandro made a allusion to the fact that this is the coronavirus crisis really offered an opportunity again, because it's a crisis that the government or the prime minister grabs even more power. So he's very much our prime minister is very much interested in grabbing more power, and actually the rule of unanimity is also giving him power, because he can blackmail, he can negotiate, bargain about agreeing into something or not agreeing into something. So in this sense, I very much agree with Sandro that majority voting would be a much more democratic way of decision making. But also that's the reason why he will never support that. So in Hungary, we would really need to have a political change, I think, in order to be able to join to a more integrated level of federation in this sense. But I think that in general, statesmen or leading politicians, prime ministers are very unwilling, quite unwilling to give up their their veto right. So that's actually I think a more complex problem within the EU, because the European Council is the one that makes the decisions, and I don't know if you made a survey about with all the members of the European Council to what extent they would be willing to give up the veto right. I think it would be a very bad result in the end. So indifferently if it's Poland or Hungary, but yeah, so that's a general answer, but also that's a big problem with the Article 7 procedure, that Poland and Hungary can support each other. So I think there should be a way to go around this unanimity regulation, or to start a convention of treaty change or something. But really, on their own will, I cannot really imagine that these two political leaders would simply give up the veto right. And to bridge the gap, I think that was the second question: how to bridge the gap if these countries are not willing to join further integrations. If I'm looking at Julius, if it was really the question, if I understood it well, or I don't know if it's okay. Well, that's why I would really support much more federation, much more federalism within the EU, and I would also support, for example, to reduce the intergovernmental nature of the EU funds. For example, now, since last October, we have an opposition mayor in Budapest, and Gergely Karácsony launched an initiative that big cities, big European cities, could also apply for EU funds for support, for structural funds or cohesion funds, because they are much more in the front line, and they are much more concerned with the development of that place. And if cities and regions and other levels of integration or other regional levels could also apply for EU funds, then the government would have a more diminished role in distributing it, and it would also contribute to more transparency in the spending of the fund. Because I think that this is a major issue that has a bad impact on the political development as well. That due to the lack of transparency, these funds are going into oligarchs' pockets or into bad investments, like not very productive investments. And if we can use a little bit the level of subsidiarity and to diversify the levels where different organizations or regions can apply for EU funds, then it would contribute more to the development of, or more to the modernizing and real development of those regions. Yeah, and to bridge the gap, I think we, within UEF, we have also a role to play, or to being a civil activist and to bring up topics. And I think also this event that you organize here, it also contributes to bridging the gap, because we need to have a links between the societies much more than we have. And also we try to start a connection with the Vienna UEF. And I'm very much hopeful that once this crisis is over, we can get more active in getting in touch with you also personally, or to have more exchange programs. Because on the level of society, I still have the feeling that we are very much apart from each other, and there is no real discussion, and we don't know how we think about the European issues. And I think that there is really a lot to do for us as well. So yeah, I think that should be a good way to approach it as well.
Thanks a lot. We're going to take one more question from the floor, from Anne, and then we'll move into more of a debate situation. So then I'm going to open the floor also for comments, not only for questions. So be prepared for that. And for now, the floor is for Anne, if you can unmute your microphone.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, because you talked about this feeling you have about the new virtual Iron Curtain, kind of, and I wanted to ask you if you already have ideas what we can do, the people here as federalists, as very enthusiastic Europeans, to help fight against that new virtual Iron
Curtain. Thank you very much, Anne, for the question. I think it's really a good question to ask, and I'm very grateful that you want to help us. And actually, I think that if we can have a more intensified relationship with, for example, UEF Austria, and maybe we can also enlarge the circle that we have more regular contacts. Okay, now it's not at the moment. Okay, we have a virtual contact, but to have certain thematic debates, or to make you to give you more information and to do exchanges, that's also a great help. And yeah, we just have to wait until the end, or what comes after this coronavirus crisis, because I had planned that UEF Austria would come over to Budapest sometime in the springtime, but yeah, it has to be postponed, unfortunately. But I'm also very much open to any initiatives or suggestions from your side. And yeah, last December we organized about an event about media freedom in Vienna. And I think also this is a very important topic to discuss, because that's very closely linked to the political situation. And I think it was a successful event, and maybe we can keep on doing that as well, to make updates and to see where we are, and how to make it easier for media outlets to reach out to European level. And yeah, I think that would be also a very nice thing. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, and that's a very good bridge to the next phase of this event, because this is now a bit less formal event. This is about exchange, and this is about every one of you, because I know actually quite a few of the participants are known to me, either because they are also young European Federalists, or because they are Schuman 2.0 ambassadors, and we are all full of thoughts and comments, I hope. So I would just ask you to unmute your microphone and speak. And obviously, only in case there is too much demand, I'll try to moderate. But otherwise, this is the time for you to ask questions once again, and also to maybe add what your thoughts are on what you learned today. So this is the hour of the icebreaker. Who makes the first move?
Julius, maybe I go, because I have a question for.
Indeed.
I have a question for the Austrian friends, because I'm really curious of how is the public debate on Europe in Austria these days? How is the perception of citizens, particularly of citizens not involved in politics, of what the European Union is doing, of proposals coming from the south of Europe, Italy, France, and Spain, and how do you see the prospects of in that respect, and the policy of the government, and so on and so forth?
Anyone who has thoughts on this can answer. I won't go ahead, obviously.
In my opinion, the common public is very positive in seeing the EU, but I think my circles are very very specific, so they are all positive, and I think it's very split, but I don't really know.
Thanks. And now I just saw that Eva Lichtenberger, the UEF Austria Vice President, also tried to answer. So if I can give you the floor.
So first of all, excuse me, I have to excuse me because my net was down. I couldn't get in, not even in my mails and so on. So, but now I just managed, I think this neighbor that's always in stopped his work. But concerning the public, well, our government does hardly report on any positive action coming from the Union. they see Austria as an island that does well, whereas the rest of Europe is not doing as well. This is a little bit subtle message that's passed. You see a little bit of a split. So the official communication is done by the ÖVP mostly, because they have the ministry, and they, for example, resist very strongly against all those proposals coming from Macron or from the southern member states, saying, of course, we want to help, but not that way. So, but I did not hear a proposal yet from them what and how they would be helpful. They always stress that they take Italian patients in our hospitals. Well, that's not the question, because they always did and they always had to, as long as they paid. But the problem is really that our politics right now is focused very much on Austria itself. It ignores mainly proposals from the side of the Union, and it is very difficult, almost impossible, to come with a message that's not in this mainstream. If you try to contact journalists and so on, they say, okay, now we have crisis communication, that's another thing. We will discuss all the other issues later. So this is what the normal answer from journalists is, and this is very much in favor of this kind of communication that is happening in Austria right now. Of course, there are, for example, as the last part I heard about Hungary, there are voices that are very critical to the developments in Hungary and in some member states, but it's not really in the focus of interest. If you have any questions, please ask me concrete ones, then I will answer again. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, is there anyone else who has a comment or a question to make? Feel free to step forward.
Perhaps I could just add something.
Yes, please.
I found it very interesting how a colleague, I'm sure he's still there, who asked this question, Europe as the United States of Europe. I found it very interesting because it depends, I guess, on how we define this. As we learned during the Corona crisis, well, actually, the federal government in the US does not even have that much power when it comes to like deciding the lockdowns in the individual states, right? So I wonder if we are speaking about the United States of Europe as a very centralized entity, then maybe the US is not even the correct example, because we see it's actually extremely decentralized. We see that the governors of individual states actually decide on what to do during a crisis and so on. I guess all of these questions that were actually approached during the discussion, I'm thinking there are seriously no easy answers to that, because I was thinking, I was so interested to hear what our Hungarian colleague was reporting and presenting, because we consider the sanction mechanism now against the Polish, against the Hungarian governments, right? So I wonder, nothing has been actually happening since these procedures were launched, right? So I wonder who is actually responsible for the fact that not much is happening, because as we know, well, the EU does have this mechanism. We all know the Article 7, right, of the treaty that actually helps the states to govern how they will approach countries that do not respect the rule of law, right? But we see that actually nothing has happened since. I think that the first procedure was launched, when was that, 2017, I think? well, now it's been 3 years, so I'm thinking whether we're looking at a major EU law reform at some point that might be necessary to actually move forward, which is, I guess, not really realistic at this point, but probably no small steps can really help to move from this crisis. I don't know. Just these thoughts that I had. Also, I found also very interesting this question about the Caucasus countries. So at the university, we have had many projects based on promoting European studies in the South Caucasus, like in Georgia, in Armenia. So I think that such projects would actually have to be promoted even more, because as the colleague said, well, how do you actually give the stage not to the populists or Eurosceptics, but rather to those who are enthusiastic about Europe? Well, these are the areas, because when we, the employees of the University of Graz, for instance, meet students from those countries, Georgia, Armenia, and also Austrian students take part at these events together with the Caucasus students, we actually see and start to appreciate what we have since we are in the EU, and we see that countries that are still outside of it, their reaction and their aspirations and wishes really demonstrate this is something that so many of them are still really striving for and want this. So perhaps at least in the university environment, I cannot share experiences about other environments, but at least in these environments where students are engaged, it's definitely possible to get a lot of pro-European discussions, especially when we meet people who are still wishing to join us. So I guess more dialogue is needed there as well, just to demonstrate we are in and we should appreciate it more.
Thanks a lot. We have one more question that is sort of touched upon already, but maybe not really answered, if it's possible to ever answer it. And I would like to combine this with sort of the final appeal of tonight, because we are moving towards the end of today's event, which is how can people like us interact with our families, with our friends, with our bubbles, to make the European idea more visible, and how we can fight the problem that was already touched upon already, that media is more attracted to populist views and always tries to divide between the nation state and the EU, between one member state and the other member state. And how can we help bridging this gap again as a civilian, not as a politician, but really as a civilian? And what would be your vision for the future ahead? What will Europe look like? And this is obviously pretty difficult to say, but what is your thought on Europe in the next 10 years, so in 2030, and maybe in the next 70 years? So what are the developments that you'd expect to happen? And this is going to be the concluding remark. Maybe Mrs. Mitskonite, if I could ask you to start.
Sure, thank you very much. These are also extremely important questions to raise. Well, I think that when it comes to the first question, how can we promote this more pro-European vision that would be visible actually? Well, if I can just speak from my own experience, I see that it definitely helps to promote European as well as European Union law studies, both at the university, because we have lots and lots of students, right? So to promote a dialogue just every day during the lectures, but also simply we also have a lot of events, like we call them science to public, for instance. So I guess we need to use all the venues that already exist and simply participate in them and really promote involving the European Union dimension in any discussions, also those which concern maybe internal matters of some sort. Like if you spoke about the migration questions in Austria, it would make sense definitely to involve an EU dimension and an EU lawyer, some professor or other employee of the university who can speak about the EU regulation of this question, to simply have it present at any discussion, because I don't think there is any discussion in Austria that would not be touched by EU law in some point. And when it comes to the second question about the EU, the vision for the European Union, well, I think that we are, well, on the one hand, we are going through a difficult patch. This is true. But I remember I read recently how a very prominent EU law professor, Dmitry Kochanov, I guess we all know him as well, has said that every time there's a crisis, people are speaking about the EU being destroyed. EU. Well, in fact, perhaps this is, we should not think about it in such pessimistic terms. The EU has always gone through one crisis or another, and actually it has always come out stronger from it. Think about the empty seat crisis. Was it in the 70s or the end of 60s, where France was unwilling to promote the majority principle? Well, out of that crisis, we actually got more and more areas in which the EU decides actually with the majority principle. So I think my vision is definitely the rough patch is not over, but there is no reason to doubt that the foundations of the European Union are actually in danger, perhaps with the exception of the very long-lasting rule of law crisis, which I think very much will depend on the action of the member states. And we have to say with criticism that, well, the European Union, the EU Commission cannot act on their own. They really need the support and action from the member states as well.
Great, thanks a lot. I can see that it's already 7 p.m. So before anyone has to leave, I would just ask you to, if you are willing to, obviously switch on your camera, because we're going to take a quick group picture, which is always good for social media and for our documentation purposes. So anyone who hasn't turned on their camera, but is able and willing to do so for a quick group picture, should do so now. And Jacopo from the Secretariat will take a picture. I can see Minecraft fans as well, that's good. And I can see that cameras are being switched on. Thanks a lot for helping us in our online visibility. And once I can see that most people have their cameras switched on, I think, yeah, I think Jacopo, you can go ahead. I think this is a great view already.
In like 3 or 4, so.
Perfect. So thanks a lot for this. And obviously now, concluding the event, I would like to ask Esther the same questions as I asked before, wrapping it up. Thank you.
Okay, so I agree with Esther that we have to take all the opportunities, all the forums to talk about this topic. And even before the corona crisis, I had the opinion that we don't only need virtual events, but we need to organize in-person events, because there is much more leverage when you meet in person, and then you can talk about problems or topics that concerns all aspects of your life. Because actually that's true that the EU is everywhere in our life, just we maybe don't. And just to be very quick for my vision of the EU within 10 years, I really hope that the Hungarian Prime Minister now will enter EU history, that the person who tested the EU system and figured out leaks, the problems with the EU, and that was finally solved, luckily. That's not going to happen again within the context of the EU. So I hope in 10 years we will be already solved this problem, and we're going to get out of this rule of law crisis. And there won't be any other adventurous politicians who would dare to test this. And I agree that the United States of Europe is maybe a bit of vague of a category, but I think that a very efficient EU is absolutely needed on the global scene. And but it can be only done if we have the basic values very solid and present. present all over the EU. So thank you for the invite again. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot. And that concludes today's event. Thanks a lot again for joining us. I know this is kind of a new situation to meet on Zoom and in online webinars all the time. For some of you, this might even be the first time that you did this. So thanks a lot for coming here and participating in this dialogue. Especially, we try to make it as interactive as possible, given the circumstances. And I will also pop 2 links into the chat, which are today's hosts, where you can check out news and potentially even become a member of If you can hear me, please give me a signal. But I think this is not working out. Okay, anyway, this was it. I think my PC is telling me to stop talking and wish you all a good evening. And thank you once again for joining, and thank you also for the Secretariat for helping us with the legalities. And to Jeff Steiermark for helping us with the promotion specifically. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.